gun sales surge in October, plus an interview with mass shooting researcher Michael Rocque on the failures in the lead up to the recent attack in Maine. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America. We send you one email a week every Friday to keep you informed. And of course, you can always buy a membership if you want to go a little bit deeper than the free email and get an even greater understanding of what's happening, with exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and stories that you will not find anywhere else. You also get this podcast a day early. This week, we are discussing the recent shooting in Maine and the frankly disturbing failures to disarm the suspected shooter, despite his significant mental health background and some of the incidents that he was involved with, including potentially involuntary commitment. So in order to do that, I wanted to bring on somebody who's an expert in both mass shootings and Maine's gun laws. And that is why we have Bates College Professor Michael Rocque on with us today. Welcome to the show, Professor. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Thank you for having me. Absolutely.
We really appreciate you coming on. I always like to get somebody who is an expert in these topics, who can bring something more to the table than what I have to offer. And so that's, I was looking around and I thought you were ideal for this. And in fact, can you just tell people a little bit more about your background and some of your research that you've done on the topic?
Sure. So I was born and raised in Maine, the capital city in Augusta. I left for school and came back to work at the Maine Department of Corrections. I was the director of research there for just a little bit, and then moved on to Bates College, which is located in Lewiston, Maine. And I have been studying mass shootings for a number of years now. I started focusing mostly on school shootings. That was an interest of mine, really, because I was in high school when Columbine happened, and that was just such a turning point in terms of media coverage, in terms of just our understanding of these types of events, the deadliness, so on. And so I was looking at it from a sociological perspective as a sociology student. I started doing some research in graduate school. Funnily enough, I remember one of my mentors telling me to not study extreme violence because, it's just a fad that will go away. So then I went to Northeastern and met James Allen Fox, who is sort of, I call him the godfather of extreme violence research.
Who actually has been on the show in the past as well. And great episode. I think he's got a lot of really important insight into this topic, which is, as you sort of alluded to there, unfortunately has not been a fad, and it's something that we're continuing to deal with. But
yeah. And so together with him and another mass violence researcher, Grant Dewey, we conducted a 3-year study of mass public shootings in the United States from 1976 to 2018, where we collected data on the incident, the offender, the victims, and produced a number of studies and reports on that topic. And I have been, in the last few years, really scrutinizing Maine's laws, and we have, as a state, we've been considering changing the laws or tightening up some restrictions. And I've been sort of commenting on the state of affairs in Maine. It is an interesting state in terms of high rate of gun ownership, really loose gun laws, low crime. And so I remember in 2022, we were talking about, I was talking with a couple of outlets about how can that be the case, and why haven't we had a mass shooting? And my assessment was that there's nothing special about Maine. We're just lucky. We just been lucky, and the luck ran out last week.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is the first incident that would qualify as a mass shooting. Obviously we get into a lot of definitional discussions around here. And I've had people from different sides of this question on the show in the past, but But your definition that you used in your research, and I think is more commonly used in these sorts of research, is 4 or more people killed in a single incident in public that isn't related to some other crime like a robbery or drug deal or something of that nature, right?
Yes, that's the definition that we use for mass public shootings. Yeah, we have had mass shootings in the past, actually this year, but they're very rare. But we had, Maine was a 0 in our database.
Domestic incidents.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's the other thing. If you look at just 4 or more killed in an incident, that most of those are actually going to be domestic incidents where somebody murders their family. It's unfortunately, I think, more common than people understand.
It's much more common. It doesn't get the media attention.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, as far as a mass public shooting, this was the very first one that Maine, and it's a particularly horrific one because Maine, as you mentioned there, doesn't see a lot of murder generally. I think it's somewhere between 20 and 25 people murdered a year in Maine, and this was 18 people in one incident. That's as far as the effect on the community, I'm sure that's just unbearable.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that we haven't seen before. It's something that is continuing to shock the community. As I said, Maine is a safe state in terms of, just gun violence in general. We do have a slightly elevated rate of suicide compared to other New England states, but other directed gun violence is very, very low. And so we just have never experienced anything like this.
Yeah. And to get to the main focus of our conversation today, perhaps another layer of just unfortunate news here is that it does seem as though this shooter, the suspect in this incident, should not have been legally allowed to either obtain or retain the firearms used to kill these people. I mean, from what we know, and look, there's been a lot of uncertainty on some of these points with public officials saying different things at different times, and reputable news outlets reporting different things. But the latest report we have is the hospital, and a source inside the hospital told the Boston Globe that this is a New York hospital on a base in New York, that the suspect in this case was involuntarily committed for 2 weeks. That had been the initial report that came out in a police bulletin, but then was disputed by Maine's public safety commissioner, and also the FBI had said that they didn't have a record of disqualifying commitment in their database, in their background check database. So there's some uncertainty about this. It does line up with a lot of the reported details that this would have been involuntarily commitment, because the suspect was reportedly hearing voices that weren't there. We were accusing him of being a pedophile and so forth, and that he had threatened to shoot people on his base where he was an Army reservist. And then he was taken by police to this mental health institution. He stayed there for 2 weeks. That was the initial reporting. The latest reporting from the Boston Globe suggests that this was an involuntary commitment, which should have made him a prohibited person, right? Under federal law. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, under federal law, if you have been involuntarily committed to a mental treatment facility, then you are not able to purchase a firearm. In Maine, if you have been involuntarily committed, you are not able to possess firearms. Now, there's no automatic process that is triggered to basically allow law enforcement to collect those weapons. And so there's a little bit of a lack of clarity there about what steps should have been taken. But we do have the yellow flag law that seems like this would have been sort of a textbook case for that law to have been invoked. And it's unclear exactly why it wasn't in this case.
Yeah, let's talk. That's the other aspect of this as well. You have the federal prohibition for anyone who's been involuntarily committed, and they're not supposed to be able to even possess firearms for the rest of their lives under federal law. But and that would be anywhere in the country, of course. But you also have what's been discussed a lot with Maine, which is this. It was sort of a variation on the red flag law. People call it a yellow flag law. It's sort of colloquial terms for both of these. I mean, they're called emergency
extreme risk.
Yeah,
extreme risk protection order.
Yeah, protection orders. That's more technical term for these things. But Maine's is a little bit different than most other ones, so that people call it a yellow flag law. But even under this proposal. So can you just walk us through how it works and whether the details that we understand from current reporting would have qualified him or how they would have?
Yeah, so the way that our yellow flag law works, it is a compromise that is meant to offer more due process protections to individuals than is afforded with a red flag law. The red flag laws can be instigated by a family member, for example, and petitioned to the court, whereas in a yellow flag law situation, only law enforcement can petition the court. It's a little bit just semantics.
Yeah, do you think that? Yeah, do you think that makes a big difference? Because if the family members tell the police, they tell
the police, and so you're kind of skipping over law enforcement in this in a sense with the red flag laws. There is an additional step where the law enforcement agency has to take the individual into protective custody. So that's kind of a big step, and then they have to basically present the court with findings from a mental health professional. And if it is determined that there is a foreseeable threat, a threat in the future, then they are able to sort of temporarily dispossess that individual of their firearms for up to a year.
Right. And so, in your opinion, as somebody who understands this law and the facts in this case as they've been reported so far, and look, it's still fairly early. We don't have everything concrete yet, but which is often the case with these incidents, and they get all the attention at the very beginning, and then attention dies down, and then you get more facts come out later. But as we understand it right now, he should have been qualified for one of these yellow flag orders, right? Yeah, I mean, at the very least, the process seems like it could have been instigated, where the individual is taken into protective custody and then an assessment is made. There's just all kinds, as you mentioned, all kinds of reporting. There are reports that he had a prescription that he stopped taking. Now, if he was given a prescription, then you would assume that there's some sort of diagnosis. I haven't seen anything that would suggest there was a formal diagnosis, but all the reports seem to indicate a particular type of mental illness and psychosis that was present. Either way, with the threats that were collected by people around him, and then the reports of the mental health deterioration, it seems like this is a textbook example for the yellow flag law. Now, why wasn't he taken into protective custody? We know that there was attempt to locate him. They were given the wrong address. Police were given the wrong address, and then they found his house, and he wasn't there. Another time they went, and he wouldn't answer the door. And so we also know that there was an alert put out to sort of a missing persons, try to attempt to locate. And so it's unclear whether that is the reason that the yellow flag law wasn't put into effect, because they simply couldn't find him. They couldn't come into contact with him. But yeah, those are all factors that are in play here. Yeah. And then there's also a report that, I mean, this was supposed to be a wellness check too. So I don't even know if it would have qualified for a red flag or yellow flag, whatever you want to call it, part of that proceeding or not. But and then of course there were reports that the police had spoken with his family, with his brother, and that the family had said they were going to take his guns. Exactly. Although there was also a report that the brother said he answers the door with a gun. So it's still a little bit jumbled, I think, in there as to exactly what happened, which is how these things usually go when you're dealing with reports from people months after the fact, usually. But as far as I understand the timeline here, he started going downhill about a year ago into this mental health spiral. His sister-in-law told the Daily Beast that he had been hearing voices that including at the two locations that he attacked, or is accused of attacking at least. And he, I mean, he's on video, so it's not, preface these things just 'cause that's natural for reporting. Right. But he was hearing voices who said people were accusing him of being a pedophile when that wasn't actually happening. That's obviously, and then he was making threats against the military installation that he served at as a reservist. And then he was committed for that reason, or at least he he had made these threats, and that concerned army officials, and they had the police come and take him to this hospital where, according to a source inside the hospital, told the Boston Globe that he had been involuntarily committed. The report was for 2 weeks, but then he was released. And then from there, he didn't seem to improve, at least from what the reporting is, because he followed that up by doing it again with making the same sort of threats connected to the same sort of false impression that he was hearing these voices accusing him of being a pedophile, except the second time he punched one of his friends, who was also a reservist. For some reason, that did not result in this another trip to the hospital, the mental health facility. I don't know why. We don't have clarity on that. Eventually, these threats were taken seriously to some degree because police stepped up patrols around that base for a time period. He never showed up or tried to carry out an attack on the base. And then I guess the sheriff's department back in Maine, because that stuff was all happening in New York, I guess. Right. The sheriff's department in Maine tried to make contact with him, do this welfare check. Wasn't able to for one reason or another. Talked to his family, who said they were going to take his firearms and keep them away from him. And then somehow nothing was done from there, from that point. And he obviously ended up using the guns, which he bought previously to carry out this attack and kill 18 people and wound 13 more. I guess there was also an incident because there's, it's still sort of unclear whether he was really involuntarily committed. We have this report from the hospital, the source at the hospital, that seems to line up with the indication that he was involuntarily committed. That's how it sounds. But, and then also he tried to buy a sound suppressor or silencer from a gun store in Maine. When he filled out his background check, he checked the box that said he'd been committed. Now that question doesn't say involuntarily committed for whatever reason, but he obviously was aware of that he'd been committed. I think that was part of one of the reports, that he was very mad at the army officials who were involved in his commitment, because it made it so that he couldn't own guns. Because once the gun store saw this, they refused to sell him the silencer. I don't think they ran the background check. I have not seen that they had. Yeah, because he might have passed it otherwise, because the FBI says they didn't have any disqualifying records for him. Right. So there's a whole jumble here, I guess, is the bottom line. Like, it sure sounds like somebody who should have been a prohibited person under federal law, which means they're not allowed to possess firearms, let alone buy them. And then who also should have qualified for Maine's yellow flag law, and some people clearly did try to take steps when they saw these signs. He was committed. He was the police. The family tried to get the police involved, and still at the end of it, he had the same guns that he had bought legally, and that's what he used to carry out the attack. I don't know. I guess just do you have any way of untangling some of that for maybe why, in theory, this should have been one that was prevented, but wasn't in practice?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there are several factors at play here, from some sort of administrative failures. If he was involuntarily committed, that should have been reported, and it should have been something that would have shown up in his background check. But the FBI said they had no records of that. So there's a failure there. And then the other failure would be not to invoke the yellow flag law. And, Maine has had this law since 2020, and it's been used 81 times. Now, most of those are sort of imminent threats of suicide. It's been, all law enforcement officers are trained on this law, but Saginaw County Sheriff's Office, they've never used it, as far as I know. So there could be something, culturally, that they try to handle things sort of a little bit more informally. It is quite it's quite a process that's involved in terms of taking the individual into protective custody, finding a mental health professional, presenting findings to the court. And if you have assurances by the family that they're going to ensure that he doesn't have access to weapons and that they're going to make sure that he gets evaluated, perhaps that seemed like appropriate at the time. And the other thing we don't know is how many of these type of incidents through the law enforcement officers that were involved here, how many have they dealt with in exactly the same way where the outcome was great, was, something that we don't hear about, which means that it worked out. That's another issue.
That's actually not an uncommon way for these sorts of situations to be resolved when somebody's not allowed to possess firearms, or or friends or family are concerned about their mental health and what they might do with a firearm. Oftentimes law enforcement will just have somebody else take the guns from them. And we've seen that actually occasionally lead to situations like this. I believe there was a school shooting in St. Louis that had similar description to this, where the police took a gun from somebody who was prohibited from having it and gave it to another family member. And then that family member gave it back to the person, and they carried out a shooting. So, obviously risky, but you're probably right that in 99.9% of the incidents, it doesn't lead to some sort of violence, or let alone mass violence like this. So, those are all good questions, I think. And then I do wonder too about, like, you have layers here, a lot of different layers of authority. You have the military, which, as we saw with the Sutherland Springs mass shooting, is not always good at providing required documents. The documents are supposed to turn over to the federal government in the form of the FBI and the background check system. Maybe that's what happened here. You also have the hospital and how that's administered. It's a hospital on a military base. So who exactly has authority over that? Is it the military, or is it New York, which is another layer? New York is not Maine. New York is a separate state from Maine. They're in fact supposed to, we saw this with Buffalo, the Buffalo shooting, where that perpetrator was taken by police to a mental health facility after making comments that indicated he might shoot people at his school. But then New York has the more stringent red flag law than Maine does, but it wasn't used in that case. And also his trip to the mental health facility didn't, I guess, qualify as an involuntary commitment, which is another thing that's sort of, I think there can be complications with, like, what exactly qualifies as involuntarily committed compared to evaluated or voluntarily committed. Did he sign a paper that he said he was okay with it, and that made it voluntary instead of involuntary? It's hard. These things are, these little details are very important in this case.
And I think you're pointing out these little details. Any one of them could go wrong and not be clear, and the entire system fails.
Yeah, and that's the hard thing, because this is a situation where I think 99.9% of people would agree that this guy should not have been allowed to possess firearms.
Right. He
was hearing voices. He was making threats, which is actually not an entirely common. I think people have the impression that a lot of mass shooters are this way, that they're mentally.
Most of them are not.
That they have psychosis.
Do not have a severe mental illness, and most of them have no psychosis at all. I hate to speculate, but one thing that I'm intrigued about with the pedophile comment is, I've been thinking about, where does that come from? And, it could be just a pure psychosis. But at the same time, so it's an interesting thing. My nephew works at a store with a person named Robert Card, who had been getting a lot of hate text and contacts. He's the wrong Robert Card. Turns out he's on the sex offender registry, though. And so, is it possible that people had been confusing this Robert Card, the shooter, with this other guy and calling him a pedophile? And
maybe somebody did that, and then with the psychosis of hearing voices that weren't really there, it kind of ramped up. Yep. Like maybe an incident happened once, and then he kept that in his head for a long time.
So I've been thinking about that. And then there's another sort of anecdote in the police reports about his loss of hearing. which the officers speculate, or they have looked into it in terms of being connected to mental illness. And so that's another element that I've been pondering.
Yeah, maybe if he can't hear properly and he hears something, and then his mind just goes to something that's not rational after that point.
Right.
Because it does seem like he was hearing things that weren't happening. Right. That seems confirmed from his, like his sister-in-law has said that, and that was part of the reporting for all of these incidents, really. Yeah. And so, but maybe they were based in some sort of misunderstanding initially, and then that just, but a lot of these. One thing that is similar, the psychosis part, the hearing voices part, that's not most not mass shooters don't experience that. Some do. I don't want to say nobody does. It's not. Right. It's just like he fled the scene. That's not common for mass shooters either, but it has happened. It does. It has happened.
Parkland. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So.
Yeah. A number of mass shooters have done that. Usually they end up shooting themselves or being caught fairly shortly afterwards. But it's not common. But at the same time, what is a little more common, at least from my understanding from the Violence Project, and we had one of the authors for the Violence Project on the show a while back as well, is this spiral, this downward spiral that he's reported to have been involved, that he's gone through. So like he starts off with relatively minor things happening, and there's some triggering events perhaps, but then it just gets worse and worse from there. And continues on, and it seems like that's what happened in this case, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There are reports that he had a particularly contentious breakup in February, I believe, and that was when he started hearing voices. And as you mentioned, there are these incidents that keep happening. I think his ex-wife and his son went to the police and said, they're concerned. And then you've already mentioned the incidents. In, I think it was May and then July in his Army Reserve unit. And so it just kept getting worse and worse and worse for him. I think he might have also lost a job. That's something that was a little unclear to me, because where his body was found, they said he used to work there, but I believe he had just taken the job there. So that could be another thing. These stressors that come in the immediate period before the shootings are very common as well. We find that about 84% in our research, 84% have experienced some sort of stressor before the shooting.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's just one of those things where this is a situation where there were a lot of red flags and people did try to act on it. Most people involved did try to act on them. And it's just, not everyone followed through as much as they should have in order for this to be prevented. That seems to be my takeaway from it.
And so, one thing that is running through my head is I think it's important to give kudos that people didn't just ignore this and brush it off. If you look at the police reports, if you look at the texts from his friends in the reserves, they were very concerned. They made sure that the code in terms of the getting into the compound was changed, and they made sure that he had no weapons from the reserves. And, they specifically said, we're afraid he's going to commit a mass shooting. And his ex-wife, who doesn't necessarily need to get involved, but did, his son, these are people who are taking risks with family members when you're going to authorities and basically putting someone's liberty at risk. That's something that is not easy to do. At the same time, it seems like there is a lot of handing off and lack of follow up, which I think, instead of saying the police are to blame and they're incompetent, I think that our system is broken. We don't have a very clear path forward. What happens? Who should you go to? What will happen? What's the follow up? These things need to be shored up and clarified if we're going to have a more expedited process.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I don't even think that should be a controversial thing necessarily, right? I mean, it's one thing to say somebody who's been involuntarily committed is prohibited from life from owning guns under federal law. Right. That's an easy thing to say, and it's true, right? The hard thing is to follow through that in real life in these incidents and ensure that person doesn't actually have access to firearms anymore. And that part is very hard. And
much more difficult.
You can criticize you can criticize the mental health professionals. Why did they release him after
Mhm.
2 weeks. Obviously he wasn't better. Why wasn't
Right.
he recommitted after the
Mhm.
second incident? And we don't know all the details yet,
Right.
obviously. So maybe there's answers for these things, but it could also just be that it's very difficult to do, to follow through on these things, even when everyone
Yeah.
agrees on them.
Right.
Like the police, they tried to track this guy down.
Mhm.
It sure seems like they should have tried harder.
Mhm.
And maybe they were too placated by the family members saying they were able to take his guns away or what have you. Maybe they should have done more on that, but it's not an easy thing. Confiscating someone's firearms, even when society agrees that they shouldn't have them anymore because they're dangerous. They have a dangerous mental health condition as a threat to themselves or others. Like even in that situation where you have support for something like that, it's very difficult to do.
Mhm.
It's very dangerous to do because that's exactly the kind of, if you're taking someone's guns away because they're a threat to themselves or others, well, that makes them a threat to you as you go to try and take their guns away. And
Right.
so, and I can understand why a lot of police would default to maybe having someone, a family member, a loved one, try
Sure.
to be the one who intervenes. But, you also have to follow up and make sure that it actually happens,
Mhm.
or this could, and people tried to intervene here. That's one of the saddest parts, is that they
Right,
really
absolutely.
did. There were people warned that this exact thing was going to happen. Now they
Mhm.
thought it was going to happen at the military base.
They
right?
did, yeah.
And it didn't happen there. So it's just, I think, underscores how difficult this can be in real life. But at the same time, like how key it is for people to follow through,
Mhm.
because if
Absolutely.
you don't, this is what can occur.
Yeah, and I think that clarity in the process and ensuring that the steps that are required to be taken by law enforcement, I think that is a lesson that's going to be learned here. Governor Mills has yesterday announced the formation of a commission to really thoroughly examine this case, and so I'm assuming that those types of things will be looked at and hopefully clarified in the future.
Yeah, and look, there might need to be a change to federal law as well. I mean, you
Yeah.
saw this in the wake of Sutherland Springs with Fix Nix, where they tried to make it so that the military branches would actually consistently share their disqualifying records, so that somebody can't. I mean, Sutherland Springs shooter, despite having a litany of disqualifying records while in the military, domestic violence, felony charges, dishonorable discharge, all of that stuff. He was disqualified 5 times over, and he still was able to buy a gun from a store because he passed the background check. If that store in Maine hadn't said, well, we noticed that you've checked the box here, and instead just let him redo it and ran the check, he might have passed, and they might have sold him that suppressor. I don't know that it would have made much of a difference at that point. But regardless, like the system wasn't there backing these people up who were being diligent, like the gun store staff. But
well, even further than that, if he wanted to get a gun in Maine, he could simply go to a gun show or do a private sale, and there's zero requirement for a background check with those types of sales. So it doesn't matter what the federal system looks like. In Maine, you don't need a background check if you do a private sale.
Sure. Although you can't sell to somebody that you know or have reason.
Exactly. If you know that. Yeah.
This prohibited person. And I be interested to, I guess it'd be a whole nother podcast on, how these most mass shooters acquire their guns legally, because most of them don't have disqualifying records, either because people didn't follow through on warning signs, or they just hadn't had a criminal record up to that point. So, but it's, I just feel like there may be space here for, like you're talking about, reform to the system itself, especially in a case that involves so many layers of authority, military, 2 different states, the FBI. Communication between those groups is obviously difficult. And then obviously trust between law enforcement and gun owners in a place like Maine is a question too, that would have to be, overcome or addressed directly, because that's another hindrance too, is that people just might not, you have to be making changes in ways that people understand and trust in order to continue to have support for these sorts of prohibitions that exist.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, that's something where we'll probably need to see more of the details of exactly how this all shook out. But it just feels like an even worse situation because it should have been prevented.
Yeah, I mean, that absolutely makes it much more of a gut punch, for people who are dealing with this tragedy and the trauma, and then to look back and say, we kind of knew that this was something that was possible, and we didn't stop it, regardless of whose fault it is, or if it's anyone's fault. It might be the system's fault. We didn't stop it, and we could have, and that's really, really difficult to swallow.
Yeah, absolutely. But for people who want to read more about your research and follow your work, where can they do that?
So my webpage at Bates College, if you just look up Michael Rocque, ROCQUE at Bates College, you'll find links to all of the publications, and also reach out to me. My email address is there, and I'm happy to send out any of our reports. And so we're continuing to look into this. I've been in touch with Jamie. We've been working on a few projects using his other data set on just complete mass shootings, not just mass public shootings. But we're going to continue to see what we can do to learn more about these attacks and particularly learn more about what type of interventions or policy approaches might be effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a conversation we could probably have again down the line here. Obviously, we focus a lot on policy here at the Reload. So,
I've been trying to get onto that commission. I've reached out to Governor Mills, and I reached out to her chief of staff, and I said, "Listen, I'm here. I want to be on this commission. I want to be someone who can give you some data. And if I'm successful, it would be wonderful to come back on and talk about what that looked like and what sort of steps were taken. And I think that would be pretty interesting for people to hear."
Absolutely. I would love to do that down the line here. So let me know and keep us up to date. And
absolutely.
We'll look to have another conversation in the future as well.
Great.
But for now, we're going to head over to our news update.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How are we doing this week, Steve?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing, Jake?
I'm doing pretty good. Can't complain. It's finally starting to warm back up a little bit here in Colorado, which I'm enjoying. We've got like a quick taste of winter last week. We got 7 inches of snow here in Denver after a long time of 80-degree weather. So finally getting back into fall. I was worried there we weren't even going to get a fall here in Colorado. But
yeah, we've gone the opposite way. We're starting to get very cold here in DC. So I don't know. I like the cold though, so it doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
You got anything interesting coming up this weekend?
I'm heading up to the mountains, actually. So my girlfriend and I are going to, her parents live up in Keystone, Colorado. So we're going to go head up there. We were supposed to do that last weekend, but we ended up not having a chance to because of the snow. So we're going to go up there this weekend, just spend the weekend up there. What about you?
I don't think I have any plans, which is nice. Just probably watch football all day on Sunday. They've got a London game this week, so
that's right.
It's a really good one too. I think it's the Chiefs and Chargers. So, and then the Eagles don't play till 4. So I just stay home and watch football all day.
Not too shabby.
Maybe go to the range on Saturday, something like that. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it all shakes out, but it's nice to not have to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Because I've been super busy for the last several weeks in a row. So looking forward to that. But what do we got in terms of news?
Yeah. So if we head over to the links in the newsletter, we have an interesting story from the Portland Press Herald, which is a local paper in Maine, talking about one of their U.S. senators, Angus King. He's the independent senator from Maine. Says he's working on new gun control legislation in the aftermath of obviously the mass shooting that we saw last week, which I think is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is Angus King, because of Maine's politics, has been sort of a maverick on gun issues. He's generally tended to hew the Democratic Party line, but he's also been willing at times to buck, for example, the David Chipman appointment to the ATF. He wasn't willing to go along with. So to see him saying he's advocating for gun laws, and then 2, the gun laws that he's apparently working on seem interesting. He was asked if he wanted to do an assault weapon ban, and he said no. But then he said he was going to work on a bill to ban what makes assault weapons so deadly, and he didn't really elaborate what that means. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of odd reading that story in his comments because he still opposes the traditional assault weapons ban, like the one that's always floating around in legislation on the Hill.
yeah.
So, I mean, that's significant. But at the same time, it's interesting because he seems to have internalized the common critique of assault weapons bans, which is that they're sort of bans on cosmetic features for the most part.
Yeah.
And that is, of course, sort of true, right? I mean, most of the features, when you look at a traditional assault weapons ban, are things that are at least not part of the functionality of the firearm. Now, it does start from a base of semi-automatic center fire. Firearms that can accept detachable magazines is usually the base that you start from, and then it's a feature ban after that for most assault weapons bans, which is like you can either have one or sorry, you either can't have any of these features or you can have one of them is kind of how it goes, and then it lists off things that a lot of people consider to be more cosmetic than functional, like flash suppressors, or to be fair, like some of these things they have a function usually. It's just not a function that matters that much in the context of especially mass shootings. But like
Right.
barrel shrouds, which are protect you from burning your hand on a hot barrel, or pistol grips, which just sort of make the gun more ergonomic. Same thing for telescoping stocks. It's another thing that are commonly put in as a feature that is could get your gun banned. And so I guess he's taken this critique and said, yeah, that's true. So now I'm going to ban the things that make the gun more deadly, whatever that means. And it's hard to understand what. I guess he wouldn't elaborate on it either. So it's hard to understand what he means. Like so semi-automatic. Is that what he's looking at? The fact that the gun that ARs or AKs are semi-automatics, the civilian versions. Is it like the detachable magazine aspect of it? I mean, again, these are things that are already kind of in the assault weapons bans to begin with. Like that's where they start. So I don't know. It's kind of odd because it's like, all right, well, so are you going to go to an even bigger ban then? You're just
Right.
You're not just going to ban semi-automatic firearms with detachable magazines that have these certain features. You're just going to ban them all. Is that? And it just seems like he doesn't really have a clear idea of what he wants to do. He just has heard this critique before and is like, yeah, that's true. So I'm going to go after the deadly features. Well, what are the deadly features? Just the basic function of the firearm, the caliber, ammunition. Like, what is it that he's going to go after? Because I think you run into a lot of problems on any of those paths, right? So which get you to likely an even larger gun ban than the one you're opposed to.
Right.
But I guess we'll have to see.
I would say, I think that's a good point. It almost seems like he's trying to be attentive to the mood that usually follows mass shootings, the need to do something, but also internalizing, as you said, the gun rights critique, because Maine does have such a strong gun rights culture in their electorate that he's trying to have it both ways. And it ends up creating something that, at least to this point, seems a little incoherent. But as you said, it remains to be seen. But this is the problem you run into with like if you're, especially if you have any concern at all about gun owners, because yes, the pro-gun side, the critique of assault weapons bans is often that what they're trying to accomplish is just to get rid of guns that look scary to advocates of the bans, right? That's sort of the common critique that you hear. They're trying to ban guns that look like AR-15s, or they look like AK-40s, or they look like these military weapons, but the critique is that it doesn't actually do anything to change the functionality, that there's still plenty of firearms you can buy that have the same basic functionality as an AR-15 that just don't look like it. It's obviously I think the golden example of that is like the Ruger Mini 14 and Mini 30, which are semi-automatic rifles with detachable magazines that
can come chambered in 5.56 or 2.23 like they are. And so it's functionality wise, they're very similar, but it's a wood stock gun that doesn't have a lot of the what people call cosmetic features. At least you might call them ergonomic features or whatever to it. And so it usually is legal in states that have bans on AR-15s and similar guns. So, but at the same time, I don't think that critique is meant to be, well, you should just try and ban all semi-automatic guns, right? That would be a far more expansive ban that affects way more people, in theory, at least. And so I don't know if that's what he's trying to get to, or he just doesn't really understand what he's trying to do, honestly, is more what it seems. But perhaps he's just maybe he is going down the path of, I just want to ban everything that is semi-automatic or fires these rifle cartridges or what have you. Because not that any of that, I think, would completely eliminate mass shootings anyway. You've seen mass shootings carried out with all sorts of firearms, whether it's bolt action rifles, pump action shotguns, everything caliber wise that you could think of has been used in these sorts of attacks. It's really not what the main issue is, honestly, because when you're shooting a bunch of defenseless people at short range, it doesn't really matter that you're using an AR-15 or a pump action 12 gauge or something like that's. There's very little difference in that scenario because of the circumstances. It's just, you're not going up against an armed, prepared person I don't know. We'll see where he comes down, I guess, or if he elaborates on this. Didn't Susan Collins, the Republican from Maine, she still opposes the assault weapons ban, but she had interesting comments as well, right?
I was going to say it's interesting because it's beyond the specific policy that he wanted. It's evidence of sort of maybe a temporary or possibly more lasting political shift that we're seeing with politicians in Maine. Because as you point out, Collins was quoted as saying that she supports a high capacity magazine ban, for example, which is a big stand for a Republican to take.
I don't remember if she's done that before. She opposes assault weapons bans, but I don't know if she's been out in favor of magazine limits before.
I'm not sure either. She certainly has the reputation as sort of a swing Republican. So it's possible that maybe she has in the past, but it's certainly notable in this context with her joining King and calling for some sort of gun law. You saw Jared Golden in the House, who is considered a moderate Democrat in the House that has voted against assault weapon bans in the past. Now he says he supports an assault weapon ban. Yeah. So you're at least seeing some sort of temporary shift, at least on the politics from Maine's congressional delegation.
Yeah, you certainly are. And this was the first, as we mentioned in the main interview, this is the first mass shooting, public mass shooting in Maine. So you should expect to see some political fallout from that, I would think, especially given the context that Maine doesn't usually see a lot of murder per year. This one attack is almost going to double their murder rate for the year at the end of it. So, we'll look for the political fallout. I will say that they're kind of all over the place. It seems like, because King is talking about doing his own new policy. Collins is talking about magazine limits, and Golden's talking about a regular assault weapons ban. So we'll see if that coalesces into anything or not.
Yeah, it's tough to say. But the next link we wanted to talk about was some interesting comments from the current ATF director, Steve Dettelbach. He did an event at Harvard's Institute of Politics last week where he made a public call for an assault weapon ban and universal background checks, which is interesting to see from a sitting head of the agency that regulates firearms. Yeah.
I don't know that I've seen an ATF director do that before. Go out and call for new gun restrictions to be passed through Congress. It's really not usually what their role is supposed to be. Of course, I guess that was the byproduct of what President Biden was trying to do with the ATF director. It was clearly his goal to politicize that position to a greater degree than it had been in the past. Obviously it's been the agency itself is controversial and has been since at least Waco, if not well before that, because it regulates a very polarizing industry. But and it does it in a way that lends itself to criticism a lot of the times, to be quite honest with how the ATF tends to operate. Not that they're the only federal agency that acts that way, but you usually don't see the director come out and say Congress should pass these new gun bans that I want, or whatever. It's just not how that job is usually handled. But President Biden first, as you mentioned just a moment ago, he nominated David Shipman, who was extremely controversial. He was literally a paid gun control activist at the time that he was nominated. He failed to get through because he was probably one of the most bombastic gun control activists in the country at the time. And so that, even though Democrats controlled the Senate at the time, and I mean, obviously they still do, but he wasn't able to get him through. And so he picked Dettelbach as the backup plan. And, Dettelbach is kind of a more milquetoast version of Shipman, right? I mean, Dettelbach ran for Ohio Attorney General as a Democrat, and he supported assault weapons bans when he was doing that. So, his position hasn't changed. It's just unusual and probably not great for the institution that he's out there advocating for a very controversial policy, one that has actually become less popular over the last couple of years, and one that one of the two parties in Congress is clearly completely opposed to. So I don't know. Interesting to see.
Yeah, I'd say you certainly don't traditionally hear heads of agencies actively lobbying for legislation from Congress. Typically it's their job to take whatever Congress passes and then, as a neutral point of view, just execute it. But, our political culture has changed over the last few years. So, like you said, it's just noteworthy to see. Yeah.
It's part of the administration's approach to the gun industry, which is an extremely hostile one, much more so.
Certainly.
In previous administrations, even other Democratic administrations. This is, this goes along with the zero tolerance policy that's led to a huge uptick in revoking licenses. I mean, a lot of this stuff is just the Biden administration doing exactly what his allies in the gun control movement want him to do. I mean, he's being as aggressive as he possibly can against the gun industry, which is clearly a political strategy on his part to appease this voting bloc. Whether that's the right strategy is obviously up for debate. Biden has gotten very poor numbers on how he's handled gun policy as president, but I mean, he's just kind of at this point gotten bad numbers on how he's handled almost everything. He's just very unpopular generally. But so I don't, how much of that is because people are paying attention to what the ATF director is saying. I don't know, but it's certainly a deliberate policy. It's not an accident that somebody got appointed ATF director who's openly advocating for new gun restrictions while being director. That's on my only point here, is that this is not like some rogue thing that he's doing. This is why he was appointed.
Right. No, that's a good point. We'll move on to some of the stories we reported this week. You had an interesting piece about a new federal ruling on California's attempt to restrict gun shows on public lands. And we have a district judge that said that's not going to fly. If you want to tell us what happened with that case.
Yeah. So the law was blocked with a preliminary injunction. So California can't enforce this law that makes it effectively impossible to have a gun show on public land. Even though that had been the practice for a very long time in California and, of course, in lots of other states. He found that it both violated the Second Amendment and the First Amendment because, I think in part because California has, as you might expect, some fairly novel rules about how gun shows work. For one, California has that 10-day waiting period on gun sales. So you can't actually buy a gun at a gun show in the sense that, you can't take it home with you. You can't walk out the door with it, even if you pass the background check and all that stuff. Which of course they have universal background checks, so you also can't do private sales without going through a licensed dealer, without having the transfer go through a licensed dealer. So, a gun show in California is different than one in like Virginia or Colorado even, or a number of other states, most other states really, because you're kind of, it's almost like an online sale. Like if you went to buy a gun from Bud's gun shop or something online, the gun doesn't get shipped directly to you, right? It goes to a licensed dealer first and you have to go pick it up. So you're kind of just negotiating on price and you're paying for the gun, but you're not receiving it yet. So at a California gun show, you're kind of just negotiating a contract essentially. And then you pick up the actual gun 10 days later at a physical store. That was sort of part of the First Amendment argument about this, that you're not really banning gun sales or any, because they're not actually really happening at the show. You're more banning the negotiation for a gun sale. Anyway, that's kind of in the weeds, but that's how it got to the First Amendment aspect. And it was targeted, right? This is specifically about this particular kind of speech, gun related speech, gun commerce. And then of course, he also found that the judge in this case, Judge Holcomb, found that the Second Amendment was violated here too, because there just isn't a historical tradition of barring gun shows or gun sales on public lands. And so, he said that violates the Second Amendment under the Bruin test. And, it was interesting to me, though, that, we got comment from Chuck Michel, who's the president of the California Rifle and Pistol Association. And they were one of the plaintiffs in this case, along with, Second Amendment Foundation. I think the Asian American Pacific Gun Association was also involved in this, as well as a couple of, I think, gun owners of California too. So it was a number of gun rights groups plus, gun show organizers that got involved in this. But Chuck Michel's comments were interesting because he was, his argument is that California is doing this in order to try and limit gun culture generally, that they don't want people to be able to gather together and discuss guns in this way and sell firearms, but mainly like the communal aspect of it is what his argument is, that they're trying to eliminate that to make gun ownership less appealing to future generations, basically, that they're not exposed to, the community of gun owners getting together in this way. And that, along with lots of other obviously restrictions that they put in place, is attempting to root out gun culture in California. He called it culture side. And so he said this was, a win in the fight against that. And I thought that was an interesting way of looking at it at the very least.
Yeah, no, that's certainly was one of my big takeaways when I read your story for the first time too, because, obviously, we've seen rulings like this before in various localities, especially attempts to ban gun shows. But to hear his take on this as, like you said, coining the term culture side, but just California making it as difficult as possible for, what is, whether or not the politicians there like it, illegal commercial activity. It's a protected constitutional right to engage in gun commerce and to purchase guns. But just making it as onerous and as difficult and as cumbersome as possible to even do that. I think it's an interesting, obviously it's coming from a pro-gun point of view, but it certainly is an interesting take on what they're doing.
Yeah, and from the other end, you had Senator Dave Min, who was the guy who backed this as a Democrat in California, and he argued, that the ban should be okay, and that he was actually cited a number of times in the ruling because he was specifically talking about how this was a novel law and they're the first in the nation. And under the Bruin test, that's actually a huge negative, because the whole concept is that your gun regulations have to be rooted in American tradition in order to be compatible with the Second Amendment. So, but he responded to the ruling, and his claim was, that essentially it doesn't make sense because it's public property and people voted for the lawmakers. And so they should be able to administer this property the way they want. And, it's akin to forcing them to hold like book burning events or flag burning events or something of that nature.
And he compared it to pornography, right?
Yeah,
right.
Porn conventions on public property. So, his point, I guess, was, this is public property. It should be able to be administered by the elected representatives of a state. So, that was the countervailing view on this. And you also had the governor, of course, Newsom, come out and attack the judge as an extremist beholden to the gun lobby, which actually Chuck Michel had mocked. He actually had mocked this before Newsom sent his comments. His office sent his comments to us. It's kind of because I guess Newsom's response was fairly predictable in that he's done this before. That's how he's reacted to other rulings against California's gun laws, is just to attack the judges themselves. And so Chuck Michel had kind of mocked him and said that his list of judges that he thinks are ideologues is getting longer and longer. And so, I thought it was kind of funny just to see the timing of that, to be honest with you, because that is exactly how Governor Newsom responded. And Governor Newsom just obviously has a very strong disagreement with the judicial philosophy of not just these judges, but the Supreme Court as well. And he's actively trying to partially repeal the Second Amendment, which is a movement that has not really gone anywhere since he announced that earlier this year. But, his views are pretty well known at this point.
Right.
But we also, speaking of gun commerce, by the way, we had a couple stories just to wrap this up on gun sales this week. The first one was Ruger, right? Ruger had their earnings report come in, and it was not good. It was another quarter where they saw a year-over-year decline. I think their sales went down. This is
13%.
Yeah, and I think it's the 8th quarter in a row, maybe 9th, where they've seen declines. So their numbers are still weak as the industry is trying to find its new floor after the 2020 surge, right? You had this huge surge of gun buying in 2020 after the pandemic and the riots and everything else that was going on in the election. So much motivation for people to go out and buy guns, and millions of Americans did for the first time. But the industry since that point has seen sales continue to come down. And this is the nature of the industry, right? It's a cyclical industry, and it's both cyclical, it's seasonal and cyclical, I guess would be the right way of looking at it. Because in a given year, you're going to have more sales in the fall and the spring than you are in the summer or the middle of winter, right? And so at the same time, you also see sales move in a cycle where you have a spike and then a decline, a spike and decline. But generally speaking, after each spike, the new floor that you hit will be higher than the old one, right? They'll be higher than the highs that you saw in the previous cycle. And so that's what we've been looking for this time around. And there've been a couple times where it was like, oh, maybe this is it. Maybe that's it. And Ruger, at least, has not shown that they've hit their floor yet. Now, there's only 2 publicly traded gun companies, right? There's Ruger, and then there's Smith & Wesson. And so Ruger right now is not showing good numbers yet. Now, obviously, the quarter ended, I think, back in September for them. So you're not seeing the last little bit here. And that's relevant for 2 reasons. One, Smith & Wesson has posted its first increase in net sales in 8 quarters. That we wrote about this back in September. So they have started to see perhaps their floor kick in, right? And the other thing, this is another story that we just wrote, is that background checks are now indicating, at least for October, which we just got those numbers in, that sales have rebounded. October saw an 8% increase in sales over the previous October. So October 2023 saw more background checks, more gun sale related background checks than October 2022. Now we use the FBI's background check numbers as an analog for gun sales because they're the best barometer that we have. There isn't a national gun registry. The ATF doesn't track sales. They track, manufacturing, how many guns are made, but they don't track individual sales. That would be illegal under federal law. You can't have a national registry under federal law. So the closest thing we have is the background check system, where because all new gun sales have to go through licensed dealers, and licensed dealers have to perform background checks, you get a pretty good barometer of how many sales there are on a national scale or even on a state scale. But, it's not a perfect one-to-one. Excuse me, I'm all stuck. Oh my gosh. That's better. So just to wrap it up, the NICS numbers, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System numbers the FBI publishes every month are the closest thing we have to sort of sales numbers in the industry. And of course, the raw numbers aren't super reliable because they also include permit checks, and some states will actually recheck all of their gun permits. They're usually gun carry permits, but also FOID, like firearm owner identification card permits. Every month, Illinois does that. So you have hundreds of thousands of those checks that aren't actual gun sales, and they come through every month. And so the raw numbers are pretty disconnected from gun sales at this point. But the industry, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, does an analysis that removes all the permit checks, or at least as many as they can, and makes some adjustments based on, like, you can buy a gun with a permit check as well in some states instead of a sales check. So they try to factor that in. And anyway, those numbers, I think, are the most reliable barometer of gun sales. And gun sales were up in October. That's only the third month this year where you've seen a year-to-year increase. And the other two were more like it was flat. This month, you saw an 8% increase. That's significant. And it makes it the third best October on record, third behind 2020 and 2021. So better than any year before 2020. And that's significant, I think, for the first really strong indication that we've had that this is the new floor is arriving for the industry. You had the Smith & Wesson sales numbers, and you had the October background check numbers, and those are both positive signs. But at the same time, Ruger still hasn't seen that hit their numbers yet. Now could just be because the quarter ended before you got to October, and maybe this next quarter will be better. But definitely some interesting news there, because we've been, anyone who's been following the Reload for a while knows we talk about that. This search for a new floor in the gun industry a lot, because you had these millions of new gun owners, so your sales levels should be higher than before 2020, and they have remained higher, but they've continually slipped a little bit every year.
Right.
And so they can't, if they keep slipping and you get back down to pre-2020 levels, I think that's an indication that something has gone wrong with the industry, because they weren't able to capitalize on all these people who bought guns for the first time. And so they haven't been able to, engage them, or they've lost people in other ways. It just wouldn't make any sense. The only thing that would make sense is if you're having sales numbers that are below your pre-spike numbers, then you're not you did something wrong, because there should be just a new level of customer, a new customer base because of what happened. So, that's what I've been watching for. And I think this is perhaps the first time we're seeing some strong evidence that. But it's one of those things where it has to, just because October had a good month doesn't necessarily mean that that's the start of a trend. That's 1 month, right? So I don't know. We'll have to keep watching for that, right?
Yeah, certainly. And the Ruger's CEO made a good point that California has sort of opened up as a potential new market because of the handgun roster restrictions, microstamping being enjoined. So, potentially this could be a little bit of a boon to the gun industry going forward to kind of counteract some of the decreases we've been seeing, because now suddenly a bunch of new handgun models are going to be available in the largest state in the country. So that could potentially be something that worth keeping an eye on and could be a buffer for the industry going forward.
Yeah, actually, I think we might be worthwhile reading out what they say they're going to start selling in California, because I think this might be news. I know that the P365 was just added to the roster in California. So as we reported on a while back, the micro stamping, the whole roster situation in California was struck down as unconstitutional. But when the state went to appeal that, they gave up on part of it. They gave up on the micro stamping aspect, which is sort of the theoretical aspect. The main reason that there aren't more guns on California's handgun roster is that micro stamping requirement, because no gun in the world would meet that requirement. It's not a real production technology. And so when they gave up on that, it opened up the door for a lot more companies to start adding some of their newer handguns to the California roster. So SIG has done it with the 365 now. Here's the list that Ruger says they're gonna bring to the rosters for anyone in California who's wondering. The Mark IV, which is a 22 pistol. You have the SR22, which is another 22 pistol. The LCP and the Max 9. So they're bringing a lot more of their more recent handguns to market now in California, because they can add the features like a magazine disconnect and a loaded chamber indicator to those guns in order to get them on the California market, because that's the ruling was stayed, by the way. So even though California gave up on the microstamping, you still have to comply with the two other requirements, which is the magazine disconnect and the loaded chamber indicator. But and they have a very specific rules about the loaded chamber indicator that are different from what most other handguns have as for that feature. But regardless, that I think that actually might be some news for people there. They actually listed out the models that they're going to bring to the California market. But yeah, we'll have to keep an eye on it and see if this. I mean, these are strong signs, but they're not. It's not a guarantee that that's where things are going to end up. 2023 is still, I believe, on pace to be a slower year for gun sales than 2022 was. So they'll have to have a pretty strong end of the year to get over that hump. And part of it is, I think, and Ruger talked about this a little bit too, there's a lot of good deals now. There's a lot of sales, a lot of discounts on firearms. So, perhaps that is starting to stimulate the market a bit more at this point. People, maybe you bought your first gun and then you were like, I don't want to spend $1,000 to pick up a new handgun, or I don't want to spend so much money on ammunition, $1 a round for 9mm or whatever the crazy prices were at the peaks. And so now that the prices are coming back down and you can get guns more reasonably, maybe people are starting to get back into that market again. But we will keep an eye on it, because I think it's an important story, and it'll say a lot about how those new gun owners have really panned out. There's a lot of high hopes in the industry and in the gun rights movement for those folks. And, we're still looking at where that has all ended up, and we're going to continue to do that. But that's all we've got for this week. So thank you guys for tuning in. If you like the show, please give us a rating on your whatever app you're listening to this on, and give us a like on YouTube, leave a comment, share this with people you think might enjoy it. And if you want to support our reporting, of course, you can head over to thereload.com and pick up a membership today. You'll get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and stories that you won't find anywhere else. And you'll get access to this podcast a day early and the opportunity to appear on the show in a member segment. So until next time next week, really, we will see you guys.